Welcome to Raising Wild Hearts. I'm Ryan Watkin, and this is my weekly podcast where I share conversations that matter, soulful talks to help you create a fulfilling life, raise the next generation with patience, presence, and purpose, and stay deeply connected to yourself, to others, and the divine. Around here, we believe we can change the world by starting at home. Let's dive in. Today, we're going to talk about something that's been on my mind and heart for a long time, education. And not just for our kids, but as humans who are wildly curious, passionate, and never stop learning. My guest, Marsha Familiaro-Enright, has spent her career reimagining what true education can be, and honestly, I think what freedom really means. Marsha founded and ran a Montessori school for over 25 years. She created the Great Connection Seminar to help young adults learn how to think, not what to think. And now she's building Reliance College, a revolutionary higher education model designed to cultivate self-reliant leaders. You often say we need to teach our next generation how to think, not what to think. Why would we be teaching them how to think?
Well, if someone is going to become an independent, thriving human being, they need to be able to understand the world themselves and judge everything for themselves and what's best for them. There's not going to be any teacher, any parent out there telling you what to do when you grow up, nor does anybody else really know what you need and what you should do in order to achieve it.
I went to a Montessori preschool when I was really little. I still remember loving it. My kids have dabbled in various Montessori preschools as well. Can we just lay the foundation? What was Maria Montessori's vision and what is the whole philosophy behind Montessori?
So Maria Montessori was the first woman doctor in Italy. She got, her first job was to work at a clinic for autistic and intellectually disabled children. She noticed that they spent a lot of time playing with their food, and she figured out that it was because they needed some sensory stimulation. She went back and looked at what all the other education theorists had thought the previous 200 years, and she created a program for them using a lot of what we call materials. Other people might think of them as games that teach you ideas. They teach you how to write, how to read, how to count, how to do art, how to understand history. The children did so well with the materials, by the end of the year, they passed the state exam for normal children. And this made her almost instantly world famous. Now, while everybody else was saying, wow, isn't this great? She was sitting there thinking, if these children can pass the state exam for normal children, what are the normal children being taught? So she was concerned about how to improve the educational experience. And in 1907, she opened a school in a very poor neighborhood of Rome with children who came from extremely ignorant families. They had, in the sense that they had come from the country, they were working in factories, they were illiterate, they were innumerate, and the children were running around the apartment building vandalizing things. She put them together in this school, not with a teacher, but just with a woman who would kind of oversee what they were doing and with her materials and gave certain instructions about what they should do. Well, the children had such a remarkable reaction to this. They got physically healthier without a change in their diet. They were so enthusiastic about learning. So the schools are very much aimed at each individual child working at their own pace. The teacher's job is to observe the children, figure out what each child needs to learn next, and present them in small group lessons with it. Children, because they want to, the schools spread around the world. There's 5,000 in the U.S. In the last 20 years, they've hugely expanded into elementary and even into high school.
You said something, and the phrase was, these children were enthusiastic about learning. We don't really see that much enthusiasm for learning. And why do you think that is? What is up with our modern day classrooms that is completely squashing this intrinsic motivation and this enthusiasm for learning?
If you know 2-year-old children, you know it's almost impossible to stop them from learning. They are constantly exploring their environment, trying to find out things, trying to imitate what other people are doing. It's their natural inclination. What happens by the time they're 8 years old and they don't want to go to school? The problem is the environment and the way in which they're being taught. It's not in line with their developmental needs. And that's something that Montessori, being a doctor and coming from a biological background, was the first to recognize, that we develop with different learning needs at different ages, and that you should set up the school environment in a way that serves those learning needs. Traditional education was not oriented to the learning needs of the child to begin with everyone doing the same thing at the same time in a classroom where you had to sit at a desk. You couldn't move around. You couldn't talk to other people. Montessori said, we learn so much by talking to people as adults. Why do we make the children be quiet? If the children are working on something in the Montessori classroom, then conversation is welcomed because they learn from each other. They invite each other to work together. As far as motivation, I had many letters from parents over the years telling me my child loves school so much that he lies to me when he's sick so he won't miss school.
Parents are like, really? I mean, that's shocking for some people to hear.
Yes, but it's true. I mean, I just interviewed a man who came to our school the first year that it was open. He had been to several other schools. He was in 4th grade, and he just had a really rough time. And he just went on about like what a great environment this was, how nurturing it was to him, how it was like a family. There were people of all different kinds there. He got this great cultural experience. He was encouraged in whatever he was doing. He could work at his own pace. He's now a world-famous video game designer, and he attributes it to having been in Montessori school. Interestingly, there was a book that came out in 2023 called The Geek Way by a researcher at MIT Business School, Andrew McAfee. He had been a Montessori student, and then he'd been put into regular school, and his reaction was kind of like, what is this? Why can't I do things like I did in Montessori school? Well, then there was another set of researchers who were looking into the backgrounds of the CEOs of a lot of tech companies and what were their characteristics. And they were shocked to find out that the huge number of them had gone to Montessori school. These researchers were given the ability as children to follow their own interests, be very engaged in learning, and be very creative. And this has a lot to do with why so many of the CEOs were from Montessori school, including very famous ones like Jeff Bezos and the Google founders and Anne Frank and Julia Child. So what's happened in traditional education? Traditional education, not only did it not start with the developmental needs of the children, but about 30 years ago, we had the Department of Education come in and start overseeing everything everybody was doing across the country. And of course, motivating schools to follow what they wanted with money from the Department of Education. There was some concern that children were not learning well enough, so they decided to install this top-down standards. And a lot of people know about No Child Left Behind, which required that if the school got money from the federal government, they had to pass certain exam at certain levels. Well, this just drove all the learning to end up being very exam-focused and not child-focused. And this happened all over the country, on top of which there were a lot of ideas coming from the universities and being inculcated into the teachers about how you have to teach the children certain ideology. And this became very incorporated into the curriculum too. Ideology, which frankly is not about learning how to be independent or learning to think well, but to follow certain ideas that the intellectuals and the teachers then thought were good to do. And all of this together was a tremendous drag on learning. So that what I see now, especially with the older students, is they just want to try to get through, to get their credential and get out in the world because school is so painful to them.
Right. Yeah. One of the things I've told my kids since they were young, and they taught themselves how to read. And I know that sounds bonkers to some people, but we didn't have to sit there and teach them how to read. They learned how to read. I still have a 4-year-old and he's not there yet, but he will get there because I've seen my other two do it. And one of the things I told them from really young when they started reading was if you can read, you can learn anything. Go to the library, right. Decide what you want to learn about, decide what you want to do. And you can literally do anything if you love to read. And I'm a lifelong learner. And I do really credit some of that to being a Montessori kid. I also was able to kind of hack the traditional system. And I was going through in the 80s and 90s. And I think it was a little different then also. still, we still had play kitchens in kindergarten. We still were like a little play-based, just like
Yeah.
naturally. Now I heard some years ago they took play kitchens out of kindergarten rooms. I'm like, how can that even be? How can that
Mhm.
be? We found, luckily, a play-based preschool for our kids. And so that was the foundation that we got to set for them. And so I see them, in comparison to maybe, some of the kids who've gone to traditional school, and how the parents too are very focused on, look at this math they can do. Look at
Yeah.
this grammar. Look at this, XYZ. And I'm like, who
The
cares if
pressure.
they don't want to learn?
Yeah. Oh my
In the
gosh, the pressure
pressure.
they put on those kids. Remember about
Yeah.
10 years ago, there was a book that came out called Tiger Mom?
Yeah. Yep.
Remember that? And she was touting the Chinese attitude of you got to push everything on the kids and force them to do everything and they'll really, really achieve. Of course, I thought it was a little hypocritical since the dad was Jewish. Okay. Now,
Mm-hmm.
Jewish people don't necessarily treat their children like that, and yet they have amazing outcomes. Given the numbers in the population, they're just amazingly high achievers, right? But they don't
Yeah.
approach it the way the Chinese do. But the Chinese attitude, this attitude of we have to compete with everybody else in the world, we have to get into the best possible, highly rated college in the world, or else we're not going to succeed, gets these parents so that they're, when they're 3 years old, they're pushing them into all kinds of math programs. Not that children can't learn math at 3, but not the way that they're talking about. Because in a Montessori school, we have amazing math materials so that children can do arithmetic into the thousands on their own. But it's using materials. It's not writing things down. It's not using the numbers. It's not memorizing things. We have literally hundreds of math materials in the Montessori program. They learn the depth of math, the foundation of it, the real world embodiment of math, so that when they grow up, they understand it so much better than a child that's just been taught how to, what's called, do the algorithms, like just memorize how to do multiplication, division, and anything like that.
Right. It's more conceptual. One of my favorite Montessori materials is the beads. And so there's a 1 bead, there's a 10 bead.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yes. And then there's like 100 square, and then there's a cube that's 1,000.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And to me, even as a 42-year-old woman, I'm like, yes, that makes so much sense to me. My brain feels like I can see it. And so it's true. It's like, it's real. It's so tangible,
Exactly. Right. You're seeing squaring and cubing. You're seeing what that means right
It's
there.
so cool. So you said the word competition. Once we had a well-meaning family member, because we've gone alternative. My oldest is 10, about to be 11. They're now doing a Waldorf education program, which we love, which is a little different. And whenever we say Waldorf, people haven't heard about it. And they say, is that like Montessori? And I say, no, it's not. But it's a philosophy, right? Based on Rudolf Steiner. But you said a word, competition, when we were talking about these hyper competitive parents who really want to show off their kids. And I think some of it is like, it's almost like dance mom, like we're living, through our kids' success. And, that's a whole nother thing. But one time a well-meaning family member said, well, your kids don't take tests? Like, how do you know how they compare to another kid? And we were like, that's the whole point. We don't care how they compare to another kid. We want to individualize their learning and their education so much so they just know really who they are and what they love and what their strengths are. Are they going to have challenges? Of course they are. But they also are so self-aware in what they're really good at. I think that really helps them as they grow, right? To really know hey, this is for me and this is not. So what's your take on that? Because parents are thinking about how are they going to be healthy citizens? Not even healthy. How are they going to be happy, productive citizens? That's what I think kind of that root model is in the U.S. How will they be productive? How will they produce? How will they go and be a CEO? How will they make $1 million? So what's your take on watching our kids grow into who they're meant to be versus who we want them to be?
The people who are hyper focused on competition, whether they're going to be able to get into Harvard or Yale, they're looking at a certain kind of model of how can they get into the top echelons of the corporate world, of the banking world, or anything like that, network for that. But fortunately, our country is amazing in that we can be entrepreneurs. We can do all kinds of things. We can forge our own path. And nowadays, it seems like there's even more and more interest in being entrepreneurs as people see corporations laying off people and all the changes with the AI and everything else. I think if a person is very self-aware and knowledgeable about the world and has a tremendous work ethic and motivation, they're going to figure out what they can do to be productive. And of course, you're going to want to help them along the way. You're going to want to expose them to lots of different possibilities. So after the Montessori school, I created this summer program called The Great Connections for 16 to 24-year-olds. I've been running that for 16 years. One of the things I'm very concerned about is that young people tend to know only what they grew up with. They don't know all the possibilities in the world. So I like to bring in accomplished professionals who love what they do and can talk to them about their career, how they got into it, and every other thing. And it's so interesting to see what happens because, for example, last year, we visited a yacht yard here on the south side of Chicago. It's a huge place. They have hundreds of boats that they store there. The story of how the man who owns it got started was amazingly interesting because he had done this, he had done that. The idea is find out what the opportunities are. Be knowledgeable about that. And of course, if a child becomes a young person who's very ambitious and motivated themselves, they can learn about that. They can find out those things. I really recommend that people, like what you're talking about, get to know themselves, know their strengths, their weaknesses, their interests, develop a good work ethic. That's really important. Be conscientious. Being conscientious is one of the most important characteristics for somebody to succeed in their professional life and in their personal life.
So how do we be conscientious adults, parents, educators?
To be very tuned into what the children need and constantly be asking yourself, am I providing them the kind of learning environment that will help them thrive? And doing experiments. This is something that Montessori did when she was developing her method, was she would do different experiments with the kids. She would change the conditions. She would add materials. She would take materials out. She would rearrange the room. She tried all that kinds of different things to see what really helped them learn the best. And we can do that at home too. I know you have a lot of homeschool parents. There's a lot of available for homeschool parents if they want to both learn the Montessori philosophy and incorporate it in what they do with their own children and get materials, work with other Montessori homeschoolers. I know that they are available. So I think that just being very vigilant about what am I doing? What is my goal? And watching as I go along what's happening with the children.
Yeah. So I'm hearing you say, and this is kind of the path less traveled, right? I'm hearing you say that we as parents have a really big stake, whether they're public schooled, homeschooled, private schooled. We have a really big stake on their growth and their learning, and we can play a really big part. Even if they spend 6 to 8 hours a day at a school, we can create the home environment as such so that they get to explore their different interests. They get to play with the idea of making a business. They get to really go after what they're interested in. So for us as parents, it takes a little bit more of awareness and steps to bring them to the library, to show them what's out there in the world. I love that you brought a group of older students to see this yacht yard, because what you're talking about is we don't know something's possible. Our subconscious doesn't think it's possible until we see it. And this is a principle of manifestation. This is, if we see it, we believe it. And so showing these kids or learners, that look at what this person did based on an interest, and look at, I'm sure, all the challenges and then successes that they had along the way, because success is not linear. And so really just being real with these kids of the sky's the limit, this limitlessness that's available to our kids. I love that what you're teaching about and what you're talking about really incorporates that in.
And one of the dangers these days is we have such a wealthy society that there's not the same kind of challenges to people. I mean, when you had to put food on the table or you were going to starve, you were very motivated, right? Now we have so many opportunities that I think people can get lost in it.
I think there was a study done, or perhaps this is just observational, but we see in society the kids or the young people who get the inheritance or the trust or the money handed down or the business handed down, and we see them kind of not be able to reach that success level. And when I say success, I'm always talking about holistic success. Are you happy? Do you have connected relationships? But we see them not be able to succeed. And it's because they've never had to really develop that grit muscle, or they've never really had to work or go through any challenge. If you grow up thinking, oh, I can't go through any challenge because, mommy and daddy handed me everything on the silver platter and they kept me away from the challenges and the hard parts of life, then you're going to have a kid who becomes an adult, who grows up, who shrinks down at the first sense of struggle.
Exactly. You hit on an important point, which is that parents need to give children not only intellectual challenges, but they need to have practical challenges too, so that they can learn how to do things and not provide everything for them. Because then when they grow up, and not helicopter them. I mean, we know about that these days. All the parents that are hanging over every little thing that the child does. And, what's interesting, I don't know if your audience is aware of this group called Let Grow. It was originally called Free Range Kids.
Yeah, Lenore.
Skenazy.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, Lenore Skenazy. I saw an article she wrote about this whole concern about phones and children being so obsessed with their phones instead of actually interacting with each other or doing things in the world. And one of the outcomes of the research was that if they had the opportunity to have unsupervised interactions with other young people, they would much rather have that than be on their phone. And so what that indicates to me is the parents are helicoptering them too much, and so they retreat to a private world on the phone. Because when you're an adolescent, one of the main things you want to develop is your social relationships with other people. There's been a decrease in that partly through all this scare that started happening in the 80s, which turns out all these missing children turn out, most of them, like the vast, vast, vast majority, like a minuscule amount, are kidnapped by strangers. Everybody else, it was divorced parents.
Yep.
That's what happened.
I'm so glad you said that, because we get these Amber Alerts here in Florida, and it's so like, it's like, oh my God, but then you find out it is some sort of like a strange parent or like a step parent situation, and it's like, oh, thank God. But the world is actually getting safer. And it's because of this like clickbait 24-hour news cycle. This, I do believe there are like dark and nefarious agendas at play somewhere out there. And like, we're not going to let our kids go outside because of it. It doesn't add up to me. Like, we have to give them some sort of independence, like go walk around the block, go do this. I'm actually in a book club right now for the anxious generation. I'm sure you know Jonathan Haidt's work.
That's what Lenore was referring to when she went in all that research. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. So we so far are a no phone house. I mean, my oldest is only almost 11, so it's not even a conversation yet. Like, it's not even in the realm of possibility yet. And I go out in our community, and we were riding bikes the other day in the neighborhood, and a kid who looked really young. It was a girl, and she was all done up, and she was younger than 10. She was probably like 7, 8. She had this phone, holding it in like selfie position, making this face to the phone. And I'm just like, and I try not to like do this like judgment thing, because I get like, as parents, we're busy and we need to work and we want to do things. And we want to talk to our spouse, and so I get that it's like an easy button for some people. But if you look at society right now, if you go out to any public place and you see what the kids are doing on this phone, it's not healthy. If we really like peeled back the layers of it, there's got to be an alternative. And we can help bridge and create those social relationships. I love getting to know my kids' friends' parents, right? And then once we get to know people, like, people aren't scary, people are just regular. They're trying to do the best they can. If you could wave a magic wand and see every classroom in the United States incorporate one thing that would really make a difference for as like kids get older and they come to your college, like, what would be that thing, the one thing?
So back in 1990, Brookings Institute did a study on what kinds of schools were the most successful for children. And they looked at urban, suburban, private, public, everything, charter schools and all this. And what they found out was if a school was locally controlled, then the children were served so much better than if it was in a big district where there were, orders coming from on high or from the Department of Education. Make the schools locally controlled so that each area can figure out what do they think would be best to do.
Since 2020 in Florida, we've had this explosion of micro schools and homeschool co-ops. And it's the coolest thing to watch. We homeschooled for 3 years during that time period. And the best decision for everybody, including myself, was for the kids to go back to school. But I'm still really interconnected with this micro schooling culture that we have here. And it's so cool because it's just controlled by the director who has very close relationships with the families. And these families are creating this new way to learn where testing is not involved. And we really get to personalize things like based on what our kids are interested in and how they can really, really grow and thrive. And it's the coolest thing to watch.
Exactly. I think the best thing that came out of the pandemic was that parents found out what was going on at school, which, I could be like Cassandra telling them about it for years before. And they're like, oh, no, everything's fine, And then they saw what was actually being taught. And they're like, oh, my gosh, I don't want that for my child. So the development of all these alternatives is fantastic. And the micro school, talk about local control. There you've got really great local control. It's very specific.
As busy parents, busy educators out there wondering, how do I really set my child up to know themselves? How do I really set my child up for success, for being true to who they are, following their interests? What's one thing we can do, even just around the dinner table at home?
Answer their questions, encourage their interests, require them to be responsible, whether it's they have to put their clothes away in their drawers or something like that. Help them learn, give them the opportunities to learn at home all kinds of skills that you might not think little children were capable of, but it turns out they are. And try to find as many interesting things to expose them to as possible so that they can see they learn what they're particularly interested in, and they can see all these possibilities in the world. And the other thing is, have high expectations for them, like convey your own expectations, but without the pressure.
Reducing the pressure on them. And it's so funny because I catch myself doing this, especially when it's related to like a meltdown in public. Like if my kid's having a hard time in public, I have quite a bit of self-awareness at this point. And I feel myself kind of like feeling like I need to punish them or say like a very stern thing because there's other people watching.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because at home, it's different. We're just a little more free and we don't worry about eyeballs being on us. But in public, like I put a little bit more, you know what it is? It's self-induced pressure on me. And then that drips down to them,
Yeah. You got to keep reminding yourself, what do those other people know? Do they understand the circumstances? You don't know. There's a great book. It's quite a few years old now, but I highly recommend it to parents. It's called How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk. And even if you just get it to look at the cartoons, they have a great set of cartoons in it about the one way to talk to the child that's not productive and another way that is. And it's especially great for the kind of circumstances you're talking about where the child's having a meltdown in public or something like that. But it's the principles that this book teaches are also good for even interacting with other adults in emotional situations. So that can be very useful.
When my kids first started at this play-based preschool, I only had 2 kids at that point, and my middle one was like not even 2 yet. It was basically like a mommy and me. Like I stayed at school with my almost 2-year-old, and I saw for maybe 2 weeks how the teachers spoke to the kids and how the teachers interacted with each other and how, the kids had invitations on what they chose to learn and how there was so much outdoor time. And it was really actually kind of like free range. You could go in, you could go out, you could lay down, you could read a book, you could do dress up. Like it was just this beautiful little bubble. And there was so much learning happening still amidst like what maybe to the outside eye looked like chaos. But I approached our beloved director, who's actually since passed on, Susan Caruso. She was just the heart and mind behind this beautiful school. And I approached her with tears in my eyes and I said, Susan, like the world would be different if everybody attended a preschool like this. The world would be different, so different. And so it was then that I really started to look back on my life. Okay, who were the teachers that really impacted me? What were the years in school that I really just like felt so fulfilled? And there are only like less than a handful of those experiences in my mind. And so for an adult right now who's listening, who's reflecting back on her experience being educated, what's the first step you would tell her to unlearn maybe what she learned about her limits and how she can't follow her interests or pursue her passions? What would you tell her?
Well, she's here and she wants to learn something different. Yeah, I would recommend that she look at there's so many videos online now about Montessori programs, about child-centered learning and books about it. And what's the best thing to help a person like that overcome their uncertainty about changing what they're doing, right? So that they can feel more calm, more certain that not doing things the way everybody else is doing is fine. I guess maybe because she's here, she already thinks that. So then, then it's a matter of exploring the kinds of books, the kinds of videos. I would go look at different schools. That's something that I think is very, very eye-opening, is when you go and see what's happening at a school. I mean, Montessori schools welcome visitors to observe the way things are occurring there. And one of the things that many people will say after they come into a Montessori school is children are so engaged and happy in what they're doing and capable of coming up to an adult and talking to them in a very comfortable manner. It's quite a different experience. See what's going on at the different schools, and that will help you become more convinced that not doing what everybody else is doing is a good thing.
Yeah. If you walk into a Montessori classroom, our son attended one last year for a bit while we transitioned, and I've observed other Montessori classrooms, but these classrooms have 24 kids in them. They're very big, but they have 4 teachers. And you walk in and there's 24 kids and it sounds like there's like 6 kids. It's very calm. And I like looked at the director. I'm like, everybody's just like doing their work. Like everybody's just like calm and relaxed and it's quiet and the vibe is just so lovely. So I love that that's one of the steps you take. And I would add to that too, Marsha, because for some reason, as my kids have grown, I've like felt a little piece of myself being able to relive like whatever age they're at and kind of like live vicariously a little bit in a healthy way through their ages and really reflect on my inner girl and rewrite that story in a sense. Yeah. So
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Yeah. I invite people to do that too, if that feels right. So please tell us all about Reliance College.
We're still raising the capital for it, but it's based on this program that I started 16 years ago called The Great Connections, which is a week-long summer program in which, because my own interest was always teaching young adults, so I started this program. And also, I could see what was going on with the colleges years ago. I mean, 30, 40 years ago, I knew what was going on with the colleges, and I knew it was just going to get worse and worse.
Can we unpack that a little bit? Because I'm assuming what you're saying, what's going on with the colleges, but can we enlighten people who might not be sure?
Well, number one, students are not really being educated on subjects very well. Almost over the whole nation, there's a certain ideology that the professoriate is pushing in all their classes. And so the students are coming out really ignorant about history, not necessarily knowing how to do maths well, not writing well, being so coddled throughout their college experience that they're not ready for working in the world and being productive and not learning how to think. I mean, that's a major thing. there's been an intellectual attack on reasoning that happened decades ago and that has now infiltrated the whole of academia and the teaching profession. That there's no really right and wrong, there's no true or false, that it's all a matter of opinion, and that it's what society tells you is right and wrong. This is like super undermining, on top of which nobody actually lives like that, because if there is no right and wrong, then you still are not going to step out in front of a truck, right? If there is no true and false. So the students are very undereducated in how to think and how to look at what is the evidence for an idea, what is the reasoning that went into that idea, what is the connection of that idea to the world, what's the outcome? If you take an idea and you use it in your life, what's going to be the result? They're very uneducated about that. It's a disaster. So I'm really concerned about that. I started this program in 2009. I put everything I knew. I brought Montessori philosophy of education in the sense of what does a person need at this level of their development. 16 to 24. This is what a genius Montessori was. She figured out the last level plane of development was 16 years old to 24 years old. Recent research has shown that the brain grows until you're about 24. She was so amazing at being able to see things from direct observation. She was great at being so objective about what she saw. I put everything I knew about, well, what does a person at this level of development need? How can I help them learn how to be as independent as possible, how to think really well, how to understand the connection of ideas with the world? And I made this program. We use a specialized form of what's called a Socratic seminar. Now, in a Socratic seminar, you have a common reading that you've done, but the teacher is there to guide the students in how to understand the material themselves by using their own questions. What's confusing about it? What don't they understand? What is the connection between this part of the text and that part of the text? What's the connection between what the author is saying here and what's going on in the world? And the teacher guides the students about that. But in our form, we do two things very specifically that make it extra powerful. One is we require that the students use reason and evidence for anything that they have to say. And the other thing is we require that they listen very carefully to what the other people are saying and respond to it and make it a continuous dialogue. So they become very learned in how to have a productive conversation with other people, but using reason and evidence. So they have to go to the text and say, okay, I think this, and look at this passage. This is where the author says this, and this is why I think it. And then the other person responds to that. So you get a very productive dialogue so that in the end, people really understand what the author said. And this tremendously strengthens your ability to think for yourself because now you have the tools about doing that. We also teach, for example, about logical fallacies. In other words, what are the typical ways that people err when they try to come to a logical conclusion or they make a conclusion, so you can be kind of aware of that, of what's going on. You can listen to some news program and say, oh, this guy is arguing from the majority. In other words, he's not giving real evidence. He's just saying, oh, everybody believes that. And that's his argument. That's not a reason, right? If you think it's a reason, you have to connect the dots. Well, why does the majority think this? Do they have a good reason to think this? And what's the conclusion from that?
Isn't that all we see on the news right now is just people kind of spouting off like things like that are just emotional based and really aren't quite backed up by facts? And if they are, they're certainly not listing any resources, right?
Yes, exactly. And what you want to do is be able to engage your emotions, but have them based on something that's real, that you're not just following the crowd. You're not the, sheep following the crowd, because that's not going to give you a good life.
If the beautiful souls with us right now could take one thing they learned today to change the world by starting at home, what would that be?
Anytime that a child acts out or does something you think is negative, it's because they're trying to fulfill some need that they have. And can you change the circumstances so that they can get what they need, but still behave in a way that's appropriate?
All right, that's it for today. As always, thank you for being here. And remember, changing the world starts in the small and soulful, the quiet and the mundane, around the dinner table, on walks, and most importantly, inside your own heart. Make sure you're following the podcast or subscribed on YouTube. And if you feel inspired right now, send the link to this episode with someone who needs some inspiration. If you haven't yet, leave a 5-star review with some words about why you love Raising Wild Hearts. And until next time, friend, go love someone well.